Harry, why don't we do it?
All right.
Get started. There are several of you who aren't totally familiar with what we're doing, so if I may take a minute just by way of introducing the operation. This is a project that is supported by the Sloan Foundation. What the Sloan Foundation is interested in is the use of videotape for oral history. Now, obviously, the written record is by far the most important for lots of purposes, for scholarly purposes, for documentation, and so on. Oral history has a different value. Oral history captures things that people will never take the time to write down. It captures the personalities, and so there's been a great deal of that done. Up to now, though, mostly with audio tapes. Now, what the Sloan Foundation is interested in is what does videotape add to oral history, given that it's a lot more expensive, is it worth that extra cost, and so on.
And what does it take away from the individual?
And, oh, you mean the victims? Well, obviously, one of the things that that you get from from the video oral tapes is the personal interactions of key people, so that they have been getting groups together that were involved in some early events, not late enough so that the people are still around, but early to the so that if we don't do something now, that the event will get lost in history. The first such tape was on Project Charles. The second one was done on the Fermi Rabi proposal on the H-bomb. They've been doing one on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they have given us a grant to do one on some of the early computers, the early development of the computer. So what we have done is to bring together groups so far around particular machines. The first session was on ENIAC, then on the IAS machine, and just in the last few days we've done 3 sessions on Whirlwind. Now, today's session is a little bit different. Today's session is not on a particular machine. It's to get to the background, some of the things that were before Whirlwind and before these developments during the war and back into the 30s in the development of electronics. And of course here in the MIT environment, because here's where we can get you together. Here's where there is a group of people who played a key role and who are available to meet. It's very informal. You should forget that there are cameras out there. You're just having a conversation. We want this to be exactly the way it would be if there were no recording going on. Just a group of you getting together and reviving the spirit and problems and achievements of the time. Obviously, you may say some things that you may afterwards say, why did I say that for the record? Well, nothing will go in the record that you really want to take out of it. If you say, that's got to be scratched, we will scratch it. It can be done with a tape. So you're protected on that score. Also, later on today, I will give you a release form, and that release form explains how we propose to use these tapes. They are basically for historical archives. They will go into the MIT Museum, MIT Archives, and they will go into the Computer Museum. They may go in 1 or 2 other places like that where historical researchers can use them. Clearly somebody is going to think about using them for other purposes. Going to say, well, you've got all this wonderful material, let's make a video program or something like that. Well, if you read the release form, it says no other use other than the historical archive, library use, is allowed without your permission. In other words, we would be back to you to get permission before some piece was selected as a juicy bit to go on 60 Minutes or whatever it may be.
Bring the check for $1 million with you?
Does a copy go to the Library of Congress or just?
Very likely. We have not negotiated that with them, but we anticipate that places like the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian might be interested.
Yeah.
And they would then have them under the same terms, that they could only make them available for research. If they were to be made available for any other purpose, that has to come back to us and to you for permission. I think that's basically all I want to say. I've asked Perry to act as moderator. He has been doing that for several of the recent sessions, and he does it very skillfully. And so and he knows the procedures and knows the problems we've been dealing with. So I think
We can only ask him to be moderate in his questions.
Yeah. And it isn't just questions.
You're excused.
I beg your pardon?
You're excused.
Patient, right? Patient.
Well, I want to welcome you, tell you how glad I am you were able to make it. It's been our lead-off in each of the earlier sessions for those new to the session to give an account of their background. Literally, we do mean your background, how it is you got to MIT, and just what drew you into your career and what drew you along your career. And if you could spend a few minutes, between 5 and 10 minutes doing that, it would be great. And I would propose senior to junior sequence, which means you, Ed, are asked to are asked to lead off, if you would.
And you can cut out if necessary.
Yes.
Well, as far as the personal aspect is concerned, I think of myself as having been an inmate of an institution. Came here in 1920 to take graduate work. My first year, I had the experience of taking a graduate course under one Vannevar Bush, we all know, excellent teacher. I believe it was called Electric Power Transmission. I have a copy of those notes made assiduously at the time. He was inspiring by all means. And at the same time, I registered for a subject with Dr. Kenneth, giving him spiritual benediction. I thought he was a wonderful person. I had a feeling that he had kind of lived beyond his means. That is, the course was entertaining and historically very interesting. He had a hyperbolic theory complex, so to speak. One of my friends called it drunken trigonometry. And then took a subject, D.C. Jackson. It was called seminar, and there were no limits in any direction. The thing that I got out of that treatment by the old gentleman was that he didn't hesitate to tell you what a wonderful man he was and then show you how many mistakes he made in the act of being wonderful. So there was a bit of maturity to it, looking at it from the point of view of the outside, interest of getting a picture of what went on in the engineering field at large. I thought that was excellent. And he made the mistake at the end of that year of asking if I would stay another year. I came here to spend a year, and excepting for being exterminated, I've been here ever since. And the old gentleman gave me this caution. He said, if you were to join the staff, you aren't going to get high pay, but you're expected to double your income in it by consulting work. That would be sinful today if it were said quite that way. And
Nevertheless.
that's the way I started out under his benediction. And Jackson was an inspiration. He took an interest in those of us who were young. Later on, Harold Edgerton came along, and this gentleman on my left was a student when I came in here. And I'm going to brag a little bit. I think the greatest experience I had was to have him do a thesis for me. I think it's the only good idea I'd ever had. And he worked it out. We did a beautiful job. We were taking a tuning fork to synchronize the a multivibrator. It was supposed to be rich in harmonics. And Julius and his colleague Jim Clapp built up a line on which they could get standing waves out next to the track, which no longer exists. And as I remember, they got up measurements up to 30 megacycles. And so that was our first venture, you might say, into the high frequency field. We got there indirectly, in other words, by means of harmonics. And there was a rather happy, not ending, but beginning that came out of this, in that later I needed some help, and Julius was to come back and join this group in communications that we were trying to start. We needed somebody with intelligence, somebody with refined training, and a man with a cultural background, and Julius joined the department. With DC's help, we managed to extract him after his doctorate in Switzerland.
Very good.
Now, my own activity, insofar as anything related to the computer field is concerned, is remote. In other words, I had an interest in electronics in a mild way, and the thesis Bush had given me to do involved a vacuum tube. And that was my first introduction to these devices, although I was aware of them. And at that time, they were pretty much treasures, very difficult to get at. And I needed the negative resistance. I had plenty of other resistance, and the GE wouldn't let me have a dynatron, which would give me what I needed. I was trying to make oscillograms of hysteresis loops. So that left me with the only outlet, and that was to make a negative resistance tube myself. And Bush was then a consultant to the American Radio Research Corporation out in Medford, and opened up that lab facility to me. And I went out there Saturdays and Sundays and worked on vacuum tubes. That was my religion for the time being. And I believe I still have some of the platinum that I had to buy for lead-in wires. Well, at all events, I was faced up to the problem of what do I do here, if anything. And with that kind of a loose, jointed background, I also cast an eye on Harvard up the way. And there was George Pierce in the Crawford laboratory and Chaffee, who were they were unique in the communications field as far as academic work was concerned. So my job was to outwit them, I guess. I went up there and took the courses they gave, and became a good friend of George Pierce, and came on down here with ideas and built up the communications option. And that was the beginning of a field in which I like to believe we did pretty well. And hitting the highlights, there was Julius, who did wonderful work in that period to support this operation. There was Manuel Ballarta, and in building up the communications, we had an advantage in that we decided that the important thing was to base the course on the foundation of Maxwell's theory, and we got Ballarta to work out the physics course to give these youngsters, and managed to insinuate vector analysis into the Department of Mathematics to support the course. And that same subject was given later by Will Alice, whom Julius may mention in time, and also by Julius in succession. But anyway, we built a pretty firm foundation, and grafting was an essential element at this point. When we lacked at MIT, lacked something, we'd go to the Bell Labs, for instance, and swindle them into having people come up and give subjects here. And people like Weigel and Crandall in the field of sound, and as I remember, you, Julius, participated in Crandall's course. You took it.
That's right.
And it was, honest to God, theory. All that had been going on here at the Institute in the Department of Physics at the time was called sound or something of the kind, acoustics, and they measured the absorption of these squares you put on a wall, street room, things of that sort, but there was no solid theory. And it was by means of seminars where the telephone company assisted that we did insinuate into the curriculum here some honest to God solid technical work in the field of communications. And that is, then came the Round Hill.
Can you give us a date on this? Could you give us a date on this?
Are we?
A date?
Date.
A year approximately.
I came here in 1920,
Yeah.
and this was this work on the beginning of communications about 22.
Uh-huh.
And first graduates were, I believe, 24.
Good.
And
And Round Hill.
then Round Hill came along. Colonel Green, I suppose we don't have to say much about the colonel, excepting he was a historic character of these parts. The daughter of this, he was the son of Hetty Green, a famous woman who carried her sandwiches under her dress and lived in the Wall Street area and became infamously rich. And the colonel reflected that a little bit and ran around down at Round Hill, and he lived at Round Hill near Nonquit, much to the discomfiture of the non-quitters because they didn't quit. And then there was lived in Florida, Texas, New York. I mention this only because when he died, the big question was what was his domicile? Who got the tax? Who got the inheritance tax? So all these states were fighting, and this is an aside, but it does bear on the New England history. I got mixed up with this because Jackson had given me the job of looking after Round Hill and trying to swindle the colonel. That may not be a good word, but it was a way of getting a living. And we had a staff of which Julius was a part in those early years. Back to the tax problem, it was MIT and the work at Round Hill that determined that Green would pay taxes. The estate tax would be in Massachusetts.
Well,
Coming back, and out of the Round Hill development came the work on fog dissipation, because we were studying the penetration of fog, light penetration, since the Colonel Green was interested in air navigation. And Julius was mixed with that one in a classical sense. As I remembered, it was where his work with Tobias came to the rescue, the scattering fog particles, and Houghton was working with him, and there are many people here today who know about Houghton because he later not only rose because of his great piece of work on fog, but also became the head of the Department of Meteorology later, so we sloughed him off from communications over to meteorology. And Julius went on over to physics to go on with his illustrious career. I don't think there's much more to say at this point. Somebody's going to have to shut me up sooner or later.
so just a few words about your NDRC extensive involvement in OSRD.
Well, I want to be careful here, so I'll depend on you to shush me at the appropriate time. I somehow, by the stroke of accident, was asked by Mr. Stimson to come down to Washington and work with him. That was April 1942. And it was interest to me in that I thought I was going to be asked by General Somerville to work for him. In what manner, I don't know. But that was the reason for my going to Washington, and I was ushered by Mr. Stimson's office. And he gave me a copy of a radar report by Sir Robert Watson Watt on the defenses of the radar defenses of the Panama Canal, and asked me if I could read it aloud and comment on each finding. I was absolutely at a loss as to what this was about. But he handed me this, and asked me if I could follow the context by reading aloud. And here was Lovett and McCloy they were sitting there as sort of a co-sponsor of whatever the intrigue was. And he said, I want you to read each of Sir Robert's findings and tell me if you agree or disagree and why. Well, having been on a witness stand here and there in patent cases and the like, I knew there was nothing to do but to answer in the affirmative, that I could read it and comment. And after about the third finding, taking Sir Robert to pieces in places, because he had been quite vicious with respect to the Signal Corps and its failure in the past, as if it should have had the foresight to be up to date on radar as the British had been because of the Germans' invasion potential. At all events, when we got done with it, I won't go into detail here, but he said, when can you come to work? He said, your first assignment is a submarine menace off the Atlantic seaboard. So that's the way I left him that day. And it was a momentous experience. I will add that I was going to have an office of one person later on. This gentleman on my left was with me, joined forces. We ended up with some 75 scientists and industrial people all over the globe trying to propagate the faith, if I would put it that way, radar applications. And that 75 we lost, but only one man shot down. It was a matter of going out to the front, discovering what the problems were. There was no use to get your ideas from committees in Washington. And so I spent over 50% of my time out of the country. But the group was drawn freely from NDRC. Bush was immensely helpful on that one, and the radiation lab up here supplied a good many bodies. And it's a wonderful source because there could be a circulation. People could go out and do their job and then go back. And I'd like to believe, reinforced the Bush's concept of regimenting the indigent professors and giving them something to do. Now, I don't think I should add any more. If there are any questions, I'll try to answer them, but I must confess that I'm curious as to the relationship of this to the field of computers. I'm simply at the bottom of the pile somewhere and got mashed into a little...
This issue is a little bit broader than that. It is the evolution of electronics that did make the computer possible after the war. That's one of the focal points.
You what?
The evolution of electronics through the 20s and 30s, through the war period, on which the computer was based.
And we'll come back to some of these things.
Yeah. In other words, how did MIT
Yes.
become to be so
Have the people
uniquely
in-
well
yeah.
That's right.
prepared, shall I say, to work in that area? That's,
Julius, you
You're
were
asking a question. I'll take a try. When I came here, that's my base of measurement. I like to believe that now, you may want to cut this out, but I think MIT was at a relative low. And there were some of the departments that had, well, tenure existed, let me put it that way. And this is with a little hindsight. I saw these people with no blowtorch on their tail, to use a vulgarism, and they had stopped studying, many of them. And a professor could write a book. Some of them were in existence in my day, and the classes were taught from those books, and the professors hadn't really brought themselves up to date for the last 20 years. This is a slight exaggeration. But I want to add that in defense of the criticism, that there were little oases or little enclaves in various parts of the institute. I'm thinking of Professor H.B. Phillips in the Department of Mathematics, for example. Physics, I think I can say fairly, didn't exist. They called it a tool subject maybe, but it had no edge to it. Some of these people were hammer-headed, I guess, but I can't go much further without insulting, but there was E.B. Wilson here at the time, and he's gravitated between math and physics, and I never was quite sure where he was going to be. He had, at the moment, destroyed most all the demonstration equipment that we had, and that might be called electronics, all the historical equipment. I have some of it at home because it was dumped into ash barrels, and what I didn't get, Professor Webster, who left for Stanford in 1920, took with him. But the department, Wilson, I believe, didn't think much of the lecture system. Brilliant rascal. Then, if you come back to Phillips for a moment, it was Phillips, I believe I can say, without dispute, who Draper would say got him interested in the gyroscope.
Is that right?
Phillips taught every difficult course there was because nobody else was doing much of that sort of thing. And he'd give a course in electricity or in elasticity or in quantum mechanics or anything
Amazing.
of the sort. He had a marvelous mind, and I think made a tremendous contribution because it was a small class of graduate students, 4 or 5, that he would pick. Draper was an illustration. And he'd take up a subject for his own benefit. And, excuse me.
May I break in?
I hope you will.
Just to support what you say, at that time, there were a number of young fellows who'd come back from Europe. I was one of them, who were very anxious to do something about physics. Not only was E.B. Wilson not interested, but the head of the department was Norton, who was the head of the DIC, the Industrial Relations Group, and the whole thing was in that sketch. Well, I and Ned Frank and Vallarta and several others,
Hans Miller around
Will Alice.
Alice and Hans Miller and maybe some others, were trying very hard to do something about this. And it was Phillips to whom we turned and was the greatest help and saw us through.
Very good.
And I think he got to my namesake, but not my relation, Sam Stratton, the president, and he finally did understand. And I remember his telling me one time quietly, "You'll be very pleased that we're going to have a new president. His name is Carl Compton." But I just want to give credit to Phillips because he's been almost forgotten.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You mentioned Round Hill and Colonel Green, and I like to believe that the work at Round Hill started I shouldn't say inter-service activity, but interdepartmental working together, because there we needed to bring down the people from aeronautics, the people from meteorology, people from physics.
Van de Graaff.
There was Van de Graaff. And the electrical engineering group, Houghton and Radford. Radford did a distinguished job on light penetration with Houghton and Julius, and later headed up Project Lincoln, as I remember, and some subsequent operations. And it's always interested me and perhaps given me a little satisfaction that I had something to do with Julius's peregrinations in that early period as a friend and admirer. And then there was Houghton, who did work in the field of regeneration in my group, and Radford on vacuum tubes, and I've left out up to this point a man I should have mentioned, and that's Barrow. Zyke Barrow came into the department for graduate work, and as I remembered, I had him for a thesis, and Ultimately, after he went to Europe and got a doctor's degree, was it Zenith,
Zurich.
in Munich?
Munich.
Zenith, was it? The radio man that he worked with? Cennec.
Yes, I think that was right.
Anyway, he came back here and ultimately got mixed up with what he called hollow pipes. He and I never settled that question. I thought a pipe was hollow, but Dyke would argue to beat hell that it wasn't. So he did work to a point where he discovered that he could propagate electric energy down through a hollow pipe, let's call it, out of deference to his stubbornness. And it was through Zyke's work, Barrow that is, that we, at the time of the Klystron development out on the West Coast in 1938 and 9, were able to take 40 centimeter Klystrons, and we were the first ones, I believe, to do that kind of thing, and applied them to instrument landing using Barrow's waveguide, which had now generated into horn radiators. And that work was done in collaboration with the Colonel Green's activities, and we were then doing work for the Navy, where Admiral King was then chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, the first chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. And there was Hap Arnold, General Arnold, who was then a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, and then there was a CAA man, Metcalf, and we tried to sort of swindle them out of money for this instrument landing of airplanes. And it was my first acquaintance, I might mention, with King and Arnold long before the time of going to Washington. And it was of immense help when I went to Washington to have friends in the service. Now, Barrow's work on waveguides was significant, not simply because of itself, but for the reason that Southworth of the Bell Company was working neck and neck, it turned out later, on this same business. And MIT had some colloquy with the telephone company to try to see that we published at the same time. And it was a wrestling match. I think they finally won because they announced the fact at a dinner the night before at a professional meeting in New York, before the papers were to appear the next day. But
Typical.
at all events, that was a great step forward. That is the development of waveguides, and you could scarcely run into a radar that wouldn't involve waveguide techniques at this time. And that, again, is a foundation of the sort that came about by catch-as-can activities, taking advantage, as we did here, what money we could get. MIT wasn't wealthy, I guess, in spite of the progress, MIT's not wealthy today, but then we did business on a shoestring. Houghton did more on fog dissipation with tin cans and tin snips, and I contributed a Ford coupe, and he took the plate glass windows and used them on which to deposit the fog particles that made for the classical work he did in measuring particle size. Now, I think that's a good place for me to stop for a moment,
Well,
unless
thank you very much.
I break in for some other reason later.
Extremely interesting story. Julius, would you be kind enough to review your distinguished career?
Well, I'll take you at your word and begin at the very beginning, because just to see how I got into this thing. Although I'm afraid that I'm telling this, it's a story that many of you have heard before. I was brought up on the West Coast, state of Washington, and very early, as a young boy, I became interested in wireless. And I put up an antenna and I got a receiver. And of course, all we had at that time were crystal detectors. And I remember trying the various kinds of crystals. I found out that galena was the thing I wanted, but there are also other kinds. And I was quite interested, and I'd hear the stations around, one or two stations anyway. Then the First World War came on. That was during my high school years. And just about my last year in high school, we were deep in the war, this country, the attitude of youth was very different then than it is now. It might be the same now if we were in a war, but at that time, all of us wanted to get in the military some way or other. But some of us were just too young. We didn't know how to do it. And I tried, but they said, no, it's 17, you can't do that. However, someone who knew that I was interested in wireless said, look, if you get a commercial license, wireless license, the Navy will take you because they're desperately in need of wireless operators. So my last half term, the fall term of high school, I went to night school at the YMCA, took a course in wireless operating, got my license, and there I was, but the damn war quit on me. Just at that time, 1918. I had made plans, as some of you know, that in the fall I would go to Stanford. And Stanford had accepted this, all was ready. What was I to do in the meantime? Why, the thing to do would seem to me to be I love to go to sea and be a wireless operator. So I did. The first ship I had was on the Pacific coast, running from Seattle to San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles. And it was a Kilburn and Clark radio or wireless set, which I don't suppose any of you remember. But in the receiver, they didn't have a patent license for vacuum tubes, so that we had to use crystals as well. Most of us, I and some others, put in our luggage a vacuum tube set and detector. They were little triodes at that time, you know. And as soon as we got to sea, we used the vacuum tube. The trouble with one of the troubles with the crystal detector was that you were coming near to some powerful stations, or powerful that time, and if you had a sensitive crystal, every time somebody calls you, why it would burn the thing out, and you'd lose him for a little while. And we had that trouble. Well, anyway, I had an interesting experience there until June, and that time the shipping board became available to non-military